If you are a church photographer, I'm gonna need you to come to the altar quickly. Do not leave your camera, bring your camera with you because your cameras need deliverance. Hey everyone, I go by V Lauren on social media, but you can call me Victoria, and welcome to another episode of Witness to Glory. I've been cranking these episodes out. Oh my gosh. Okay. So if you attend a church where the church utilizes big screens, any type of screens in the background, this is an issue that you might run into. This is why you need to be delivered, okay? Or maybe it's me, maybe I'm the problem. When I first started out doing photography, I primarily shot in aperture priority mode or AV mode because I didn't know anything about ISO. I didn't know anything about shutter speed. I really didn't even know what aperture was, but I was like, it's taking pictures in this mode is all I knew. And so even when I was doing church photography, I primarily shot in aperture priority mode. I'm a self-taught photographer. So as I took pictures more and more, I started to understand and realize what the purpose of aperture priority mode was, which is that it prioritizes the aperture. The benefits of using AV mode or aperture priority mode was that the camera was doing the bulk of the work for me when it came to exposing the shots. So all I had to do was set the aperture, which for the most part stayed around f1.8, especially because I was working in a low light environment with no flash. So I just used the maximum aperture at my disposal, which was f1.8. And the camera would set the shutter speed and ISO accordingly, especially if I was shooting in auto ISO. And that way of shooting worked well for me because of the lighting conditions. But over time, as I grew more comfortable with photography, I started to test around with manual mode. So I would go back and forth throughout the service, shooting in AV mode and then shooting in manual mode. One Sunday, I shot the entire service accidentally in manual mode. I shouldn't say shot because that sounds crazy. I photographed the entire service in manual mode. And I didn't even realize that I never switched back over to AV mode because I would go back and forth. But for this particular Sunday, I just completely photographed the whole entire service in manual mode. But there was something very disturbing that I noticed in my photos. What is this distortion? I had never seen it before when I was taking pictures in AV mode. So it led me to the false conclusion that, this is a problem with manual mode. I was really troubled by why this distortion looks so crazy. So I did some searching on Google and I was like, what kind of distortion is this? Because I was familiar with what the moire pattern looked like, but I said, this does not look like that. Here's the thing. It is the moire pattern. When taking pictures, you might come across strange rainbow patterns in photographs that contain a lot of fine detail. Moire pattern occurs when a scene or an object that is being photographed contains repetitive details, such as lines, dots, etc., that exceed sensor resolution. As a result, the camera produces strange looking wavy patterns. And I was like, okay, this more fits what I'm looking at. How do I get rid of this in my photos? And so at the time, I was under the impression that the problem was with manual mode, or should I say the settings that I was using. I didn't have that issue when I was shooting in aperture priority mode or AV mode. And so when I was looking into this unusual pattern, I came across this article titled, "Why Do Screens Look Weird in Pictures?" And this is what I learned. To understand why computer/TV screens look strange in photos, you need to understand how the shutter speed works because the issue is related to that. The article defined shutter speed as the amount of time that the shutter is open, or in other words, it means how much time does your camera spend taking that picture. Now that we've defined what the shutter speed is, there's the other part of the problem, which is the image that is being projected on, in this case, the TV screen. So the article states that The image on your TV/laptop/computer screen is always changing at a rate between 50 Hz to 360 Hz. The moire pattern you're getting in your photos is the result of your camera not having a fast enough shutter speed, which is causing it to capture the screen in the middle of its refreshing process. So in order to avoid the moire pattern in this context, the article explains that your shutter speed has to match with the refresh rate of the screen you are trying to take a picture of. If they don't match, you will see dark spots and the moire pattern will happen. So this distortion is something that I run into often as a church photographer. And so after reading that, I realized something. The reason why I did not see this distortion as much while shooting in aperture priority mode is because the camera is adjusting the shutter speed to get the appropriate exposure. So whatever shutter speed it was setting my camera to, it fixed the distortion. The camera drops the shutter speed in order to get the correct mid-tone exposure. When I was shooting in manual mode, meaning I had controls of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, I realized that I was setting my shutter speed at a faster rate. I took it upon myself to increase the shutter speed to freeze the motion, but I did not realize that when I was freezing the motion, I was also capturing the screen during its refresh rate. This was creating the moire pattern or the distortion that I was getting in the images. So realizing that, I went through my photos that have the worst case of the moire pattern and I began to compare the shutter speed rates with the photos that had zero distortion. And from that, I observed a trend. So at 1/80th of a second, there was no moire pattern, but there was motion blur. At 1/100th to 1/125th of a second, I found it to be a good sweet spot. But then I realized that if I shot anything above 1/500th of a second, then I would see the moire pattern. Now, the thing is, the article that I read mentioned how if you're taking a picture of a computer screen with your cell phone, the shutter speed would have to be increased. But in my case, with my camera taking a picture of this huge screen at church, my shutter speed has to decrease. So that means I have to shoot at a slower shutter speed in order to avoid getting this distortion. So after taking photos at church and testing out what is the sweet spot for me, I found that shooting around 1/160th of a second was a perfect sweet spot to freeze motion without getting the distortion as much. It's still there a little bit, but it's not as noticeable. So it seems like that works best for the refresh rate of the screen, at least in my case. Okay, so if you are taking photos at church and you notice this distortion, you see this weird looking pattern, change your shutter speed. So changing your shutter speed might require you to adjust your ISO. For me, it doesn't really require me to change my aperture because I'm always going to keep my aperture the same. I'm just going to toggle between my shutter speed and my ISO. That's how I expose leading with my aperture because I think I taught myself or conditioned myself to get the right exposure based upon my aperture setting. And so if you run into this issue, adjust your shutter speed and play around with it. That's what I had to do in order to get rid of this distortion. So now when I take photos at church, I know that if I'm shooting at a fast shutter speed, I'm going to get the distortion. I know if I'm shooting at a slower shutter speed, I'm not going to get this distortion at all. It's not you. It's me. It's me. It's me. It's me. It's me standing in the need of prayer. But I wanted to share my full experience because I feel like this is not talked about a lot, especially in the church photography realm. And this is something that I've came across and I really didn't have an answer to until I had to do some digging. And even the answer that I found wasn't even directly related to what I was actually doing. I hope this is helpful to photographers out there who are running into this distortion and they don't know what is causing it. When I was starting out taking photos, we had just transitioned to using this screen. So photographers beforehand didn't have this issue. But I'm curious to know if you're a photographer who has run into this issue and you solved it on your own. I would love to hear Did you come to the same conclusion as I did? What are your go-to settings as a photographer? What is your shutter speed typically set at, especially if you are taking photos where you have these type of screens in the background? So please feel free to share in the comment section below. But more importantly, the reason why I wanted to tackle this topic is because I believe that it will make us better, you say it with me, witnesses to glory.